Today we're going to be talking about adding and subtracting integers. Before you can add or subtract an integer, you must first know how to find the absolute value of a number. Picture a number line. To find the absolute value of the number 3, you find the distance it is from 0. So we would count 1, 2, 3. The absolute value of the number 3 is 3 because it's 3 spaces away from 0. Now to find the absolute value of the number -2, we do the same thing. It's 1, 2 spaces away from 0. So the absolute value of -2 is 2. Okay. So now when you add positive and negative numbers, you're paying attention to the signs. So if we're adding numbers that have the same sign, it makes it really easy. You add the absolute value and keep the sign. For instance, 3 plus 5 equals 8. That's an easy one. -3 plus -5. We think about the absolute values. 3 plus 5 is 8, but they're both negative, so our answer is negative. -3 plus -5 equals -8. This works for other numbers as well. -6, the absolute value is 6. -4, the absolute value is 4. So -6 plus -4 equals -10. When you add two numbers with different signs, you're going to be finding the absolute value of the numbers and finding the difference between the two. And then whichever number is greater, that's the number that has the sign. For instance, -4 plus 6. So we think about the absolute value of each number. The absolute value of -4 is 4. The absolute value of 6 is just 6. Now, 6 is the greater number, and it happens to be a positive number. So -4 plus 6, remember we find the difference of the absolute value. 6 minus 4 is 2. The 6 is the greater number, that's the one whose sign we take. So our sum then is 2. Now if we're dealing with it where the greater absolute value is a negative number, for instance, -3 plus 2. Well, -3 has a greater absolute value, so it's going to be a negative answer. Now we find the difference between their absolute values. 3 minus 2 equals 1. So -3 plus 2 equals -1. Remember, it's negative because the 3 is negative. Now I'm going to use algebra tiles to model what neutral pairs are and what they're also sometimes called zero pairs. When we have a positive, so imagine this is +1, and a -1, they cancel each other out. They represent a zero pair. I call them neutral pairs. We're going to use these neutral pairs to help us in adding and subtracting integers. So we're going to do this to model our number sentence before. We had -4 plus +6. So right here I have 4 negatives and I have 6 positives. Now we can make neutral pairs. These will cancel each other out. And you can see that I'm left with +2. -4 plus 6 equals +2. The other example I used was -3 plus 2. So if I have 3 negatives and 2 positives, we're going to form neutral pairs and we're left with -1. -3 plus 2 equals -1. Now for the inverse property of addition. That sounds complicated, but really it's not. What you need to think of is opposites. So the opposite of 3 is -3. The opposite of 2 is negative 2. So the inverse property of addition simply states that the sum of two numbers is 0, which is just our opposites. So now we're going to be subtracting integers. To do this, we're going to be using the inverse property of addition. We're going to find the opposites. So when we subtract integers, we're actually going to add the opposite, and then we'll use the absolute value rule with signs. For instance, we have 3 minus 8. Now rather than subtracting, remember we add the opposite. So what's the opposite of 8? Negative 8. So instead of saying 3 minus 8, we're going to say 3 plus negative 8. And then remember, we have different signs there. We have a positive 3 and we have a negative 8. So remember, the rule is that we find the absolute values, and the number that gets the sign is the larger absolute value, which is 8. So in this case, it's going to be a negative answer. So we're going to find the difference. The difference between 8 and 3 is 5, and then it will take the negative sign. So 3 minus 8 is negative 5. And the other way of saying that, 3 plus negative 8. Remember, when we're subtracting integers, we add the opposite. So for another example, we have negative 4 minus 5. Remember, we add the opposite. So the opposite of 5 is negative 5. So instead of saying negative 4 minus 5, we say negative 4 plus negative 5. Now I'd like to model for you how you would use algebra tiles to set up these problems. We're going to use the first example of 3 minus 8. So I have positive 3 here, and we have positive 8 really, because it's 3 minus 8. However, remember, we add the opposite. So the opposite of 8 is negative 8. We find our neutral pairs, and we're left with negative 5. Now for another example, negative 4 minus 5. Remember, when we're subtracting integers, we're going to add the opposite. So it's going to be negative 4 plus negative 5. We can use our algebra tiles to show this. Here I have negative 4, and here I have negative 5. If I put them together, negative 4 plus negative 5, I have negative 9. I'd like to do another example. 3 minus 6. Remember, we're going to add the opposite. So instead of saying 3 minus 6, I'm going to say 3 plus negative 6. So now I have 3 plus negative 6. I find my neutral pairs, and I'm left with negative 3. For our last example, I'd like to do negative 4 minus negative 6. Remember, we add the opposite. Instead of saying negative 4 minus negative 6, we're going to say negative 4 plus 6. So here's my negative 4, and now I'm going to add 6 more. We're going to find our neutral pairs, and you see we're left with positive 2. Negative 4 plus 6 equals positive 2. Now remember, the most important thing when you're subtracting integers, you add the opposite. It makes it much simpler. Now whether you're adding or subtracting integers, it often will help for you to use something like algebra tiles. You can also even draw it by using simple plus signs and minus signs to represent your positives and your negatives. When you're stuck with a problem that's huge, negative 300 plus 25, well, you can simplify it. You can go negative 5 plus 2. And that'll help you remember what the process is so that you can apply it to a larger or more complex number. So by following these simple rules, you'll be able to add and subtract negative and positive integers.